The day Harlan Briggs drove his truck through the gates of Callaway Fabrication, he already knew they didn't want him there. He'd gotten the call from a junior procurement assistant, not even a manager, just a kid named Todd who sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We need someone to look at the secondary press line. You do industrial maintenance." Harlan had said yes, he always said yes. 41 years old, running a one-man shop out of a converted warehouse on Route 9 outside Elkhart, Indiana, Harlan Briggs said yes to every job that came through the door because there was no one else to say it. Callaway Fabrication was one of those companies that had grown faster than its own good sense. 12 years ago, it had been a family stamping operation. Now it occupied 40 acres of metal buildings and employed close to 300 people, and somewhere in between the growth and the money, it had stopped knowing what it actually was. The lobbies had been renovated twice. The executive floor had floor-to-ceiling glass. But the machines on the floor were the same ones from 1987, and nobody wanted to talk about that. Harlan pulled his F-250 into the visitor lot, grabbed his toolbox, and checked in at the front desk. He wore steel-toed boots and a gray Henley with a small grease stain near the collar that he'd noticed too late to change. He thought about it for half a second, then stopped thinking about it. He was there to fix a press line, not impress anybody. They made him wait 20 minutes before someone came down to get him. The someone was Renata Cross. She was the vice president of operations at Callaway, and she walked like she owned every inch of floor she stepped on. Mid-40s, sharp suit, hair pulled back in a way that looked casual but wasn't. She shook Harlan's hand the way you shake someone's hand when you've already decided they're beneath you, firm enough to be polite, brief enough to be clear. "Mr. Briggs." Not a question, just a filing of his name somewhere she could retrieve it later if she needed to. "Yes, ma'am." She glanced at his toolbox, then at his truck through the window, then back at him. "You came alone, I work alone." A small pause. "And your company is Briggs Industrial Services, Route 9, just outside Elkhart." He'd said that line 10,000 times. It always felt the same, half pride, half apology. Renata Cross looked at him for one more moment. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. He'd been looked at that way before, by people who equated the size of your operation with the depth of your competence. She turned and started walking, and he followed, toolbox in hand, through the lobby and the glass doors and out onto the production floor. The press line was in bad shape. He could see it before she finished explaining the problem. A secondary die station had been misfiring, inconsistent stroke timing, which was throwing off tolerances downstream. 3 weeks of bad product, 2 client complaints, 1 near miss on a safety check. She listed these facts the way you list items on a grocery receipt. "How long will this take?" she asked. Harlan crouched down beside the hydraulic manifold and already had his flashlight out. "Depends on what I find. Our previous contractor said 2 days. Your previous contractor was wrong." She didn't like that. He could feel it without looking up. He spent 4 hours on the floor that first day. He didn't eat lunch. He drank bad coffee from a vending machine and kept a yellow notepad covered in diagrams that no one else could have deciphered. By 3 in the afternoon, he had found not 1 problem but 4, a worn timing cam, a cracked accumulator housing, 2 solenoid valves that were operating outside spec, and a hydraulic line that had been routed incorrectly during the last maintenance cycle and had been slowly starving the secondary circuit of pressure ever since. He went back to the front office to give his preliminary assessment. Renata Cross was in a meeting. He waited. When she came out 20 minutes later, she looked at him with mild surprise, as if she'd already forgotten he was there. "I've got a full picture of what's happening," he said, and walked her through it. He kept it simple. He was good at making complex things simple for people who needed to make decisions. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You found all of that today?" "Yes. The previous contractor was here for 3 days and replaced 2 solenoids. He fixed the easiest part and called it done." She looked at him, not with respect exactly. More like reassessment, the kind you do when a variable doesn't fit your original equation. "What's your quote for the full repair?" He gave her a number. It was fair. It was less than half what a larger firm would have charged because he had no overhead to protect, no sales staff to pay, no company truck fleet burning diesel between jobs. She looked at the number, looked at him. "That seems low. It's accurate." Another pause. "Then, I'll need to run this up the chain. In the meantime," she glanced toward the production floor, "don't touch anything until you hear back from us." He nodded. He picked up his toolbox. He started walking toward the exit. That was when he heard her talking to one of her directors in the corridor just off the lobby. She hadn't bothered to lower her voice. "He runs some little one-man shop out on Route 9. I don't know why Todd called him. We can't have a guy like that representing us to the floor supervisors. It looks bad." The director said something Harlan couldn't make out. "I know he found the issues. I'm just saying, appearances matter." If we're going to bring in outside contractors, we need people who look like they belong here. Harlan pushed through the front door. The November air hit him in the face, cold and clean, and he stood next to his truck for a moment before getting in. He wasn't angry. Or maybe he was, but it was the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't burn, just settles. He'd heard versions of that sentence his whole working life. People who look like they belong here. As if belonging had anything to do with what you knew or what you could do with your hands and your mind at 3 in the afternoon with a dead press line and a notepad. He drove back to the shop on Route 9 and finished a hydraulic pump rebuild for a plastic injection company in South Bend. He invoiced them. He swept the floor. He went home. 2 days later, Todd called. They wanted him to proceed with the repair. He went back. He did the work. It took him 4 days, including fabricating a replacement accumulator housing from scratch, because the OEM part was back-ordered 8 weeks, and Harlan's shop had a lathe and he knew how to use it. When he was done, the press line ran cleaner than it had in years. He knew because he ran test cycles for 2 hours and logged every stroke. The floor supervisor, a heavy-set man named Dale Hutchins. Harlan crossed himself mentally. Wrong, that name was on the list. A man named Ray, who'd been with Cacklaway for 19 years, walked the line with him at the end and said quietly, "I've never seen this thing run like this." Harlan said, "It should have been running like this the whole time." Ray nodded. He looked like a man who'd been told the same thing once before and hadn't been listened to. Harlan submitted his final invoice. Renata Cross approved it without comment. He didn't hear from Callaway again for 11 months. During those 11 months, Harlan Briggs did what he always did. He worked. He had 6 regular clients and a rotating handful of one-time jobs. He maintained press equipment, hydraulic systems, CNC machinery, conveyor lines, and the occasional piece of agricultural equipment that came in from the farms south of town. He charged fair rates. He showed up when he said he would. He fixed what was broken and didn't invent problems that weren't there. His shop was 2,000 square feet of organized function. Not pretty, but every tool in a place, every surface lit. He'd bought the building 9 years ago when the previous owner, a body shop, had gone under. He'd replaced the wiring and the lighting himself, poured a new floor section in the back, installed a ventilation system. People drove by Route 9 sometimes and saw the plain metal building with the small painted sign, Briggs Industrial Services, and assumed it was nothing. Harlan had stopped caring what people assumed. What he was doing during those 11 months, without quite naming it, was watching. He read industry publications. He watched what was happening in the stamping and fabrication sector in northern Indiana. He talked to floor supervisors and maintenance managers at the companies he worked with, men like Ray who actually knew what was happening on the production floor. He kept his yellow notepads. He thought about what he saw. What he saw was this. A lot of mid-sized fabrication operations were investing in automation they didn't fully understand, outsourcing maintenance to firms that serviced the equipment without really knowing it, and creating a growing gap between what their machines were capable of and what their machines were actually doing. The gap was expensive. Most of them didn't know how expensive. Harlan understood that gap. He'd spent his working life living inside it. He also noticed that Callaway Fabrication was one of the operations trending in the wrong direction. He heard things through Ray, through Todd, who'd become something of a quiet ally. The company had hired a new director of purchasing who was pushing hard on cost reduction. They'd switched to a larger maintenance contractor based out of Columbus, one of those firms with branded uniforms and a dispatch system and a 2-day response window. 3 months after the switch, 2 of Callaway's production lines were averaging 4 unplanned stoppages per week. Harlan heard this and wrote nothing down. He just remembered it. The second call from Callaway came on a Tuesday morning in October. It wasn't Todd this time. It was a different name, a different title, Director of Operations. Someone new, a man named Paul, who sounded tired in the way that middle managers sound tired after 6 months of being blamed for decisions they didn't make. "Mr. Briggs, I got your name from a floor supervisor here. I understand you did some work for us about a year ago." "I did. We're in a situation. Our current contractor has a 3-day window on emergency calls. We have a press line down and parts coming off spec on 2 other stations. I need someone who can be here today." Harlan looked at his schedule. He had a pump rebuild for a customer in Goshen that could wait 1 day. "I can be there by 11. He was there by 10:40. The situation was worse than Paul had described. 3 months of deferred maintenance had compounded in the way that deferred maintenance always does. 1 problem becomes 2, 2 becomes 5, and by the time someone calls it an emergency, it's actually a crisis. Harlan spent the first 2 hours just assessing, which Paul watched with visible anxiety. "Can you fix it?" Paul asked around noon. "Most of it," Harlan said. "Some of the wear on the secondary tooling is going to need replacement parts. I can fabricate temporary solutions to keep you running, but you'll need the correct components within 60 days or you're back in this same position. What does that mean for today? It means you'll be back up by end of shift. Paul looked like he might actually exhale for the first time in a week. He was back up by 4:30. Renata Cross came down to the floor at 5 o'clock. She was surprised to see Harlan there. He could tell because her expression shifted for a moment before she reassembled it. Mr. Briggs. Again, not a question. Miss Cross. She looked at the running press line. Then at Paul, who gave a small nod. I didn't realize you'd been called in, she said. Your director reached out this morning. A pause. Our current contractor has a 3-day window. He said it without inflection, just fact. She looked at him for a moment. There was something different in it this time. Not warmth. He wasn't expecting warmth from a woman like Renata Cross, and he didn't need it, but something closer to a genuine look, like she was actually seeing him for the first time. Thank you, she said, and then walked back toward the executive floor. Over the next 4 months, Harlan came back to Callaway 8 more times. Always called by Paul, always on short notice, always on situations the Columbus contractor hadn't gotten to or hadn't solved. He didn't advertise this. He showed up, did the work, left an invoice, went home. Ray started calling him directly. Small things, a question about a hydraulic spec, a heads up about a new noise on the die press. Harlan answered when Ray called. He always had. In February, Paul invited him to a brief meeting in a small conference room off the production floor, just the two of them. Paul closed the door. I'm going to be honest with you, Paul said. The situation here is not good. The current contractor has cost us more in downtime losses than their contract is worth. I've been making the case to bring our maintenance in-house or establish a primary vendor relationship with someone who actually knows this equipment. Harlan listened. I want to propose you as that vendor, Paul said. Not emergency calls, a retainer. Monthly engagement, priority response, regular preventive work. Harlan thought for a moment. What's the hesitation? Paul looked at him. Miss Cross. She values presentation. She's more comfortable with larger firms. Harlan nodded slowly. He'd known this conversation had a shape, and now he knew what the shape was. What would change her mind, he asked. Results she can't argue with, Paul said, which you've already started building. Harlan went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He had a yellow notepad in front of him. He didn't write anything on it for a while. Just sat. He thought about what he wanted. Not what he could get or what was reasonable to expect, what he actually wanted. He was 41 years old and he ran a good shop, and he was tired of being seen as the guy you call when you're desperate, the fallback, the afterthought. He wanted to build something that couldn't be overlooked, something that when people drove by they understood. He called his banker the next morning. He called an equipment broker he'd known for 12 years. He called a commercial real estate agent in Elkhart County and told her what he was looking for. He wasn't impulsive about it. It took him 7 months. During those 7 months, he kept every client, kept showing up at Callaway, kept building his retainer case through results. He saved aggressively. He got pre-approved for a business loan. He was methodical and quiet about all of it. In September, a 12,000-square-foot industrial facility on the east side of Elkhart came on the market. It had been a precision tooling operation that had closed after the owner's death. The equipment was dated but solid. The building was in good repair. It had 3-phase power and a loading dock and enough room to expand. Harlan made an offer. It took 3 weeks to close. He signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in a title company office with no one there but him and the seller's estate attorney and a notary. No celebration, no champagne. He drove to the new building, unlocked the door, stood inside the empty space and listened to how sound moved in it. Then he went back to Route 9 and finished the work. He spent the next 6 months building the new operation quietly and systematically. He moved his existing equipment. He sourced 2 additional precision machines, a CNC lathe and a vertical machining center, from auctions. He hired 2 people, a machinist named Leonard who'd been laid off from a larger shop in Mishawaka, and a maintenance technician named Owen. He wrote process documentation. He created maintenance protocol templates. He bought a small fleet software package and started tracking response times and client equipment histories with the kind of rigor he'd previously kept only in yellow notepads. What he was building, though he wouldn't have called it this, was infrastructure for a company that operated at a different scale. He wasn't trying to get bigger for the sake of being bigger. He was trying to get capable, actually formally, verifiably capable, in a way that left no one room to question it. He told Paul what he was doing, just Paul, and Ray. Paul nodded and said, "Keep me informed." Ray said, "You're going to be fine." The conversation with Renata Cross happened in November, just over 2 years after she'd stood in that lobby corridor and said he didn't look like he belonged. Paul had set up a formal vendor review. It was Harlan's first time presenting in the conference room on the executive floor, which had the floor-to-ceiling glass and the view of the fabrication floor 40 feet below. He'd come with a binder. Not a thick padded for impression binder, a clean factual binder with 12 months of data on every engagement he'd had with Callaway, response times, problem diagnoses, parts sourced, downtime reduced, cost avoided. All of it documented with dates and specifics, the kind of documentation that a larger firm would have had a junior analyst produce. Harlan had done it himself at the kitchen table. Renata Cross sat across from him. Paul was there, a finance director whose name Harlan didn't retain. She opened the binder. She read, not skimmed, read. He could tell by the way her eyes moved. After several minutes, she looked up. This is your operation, just you and 2 employees? Currently, yes. I'm evaluating a 3rd hire. She looked back at the data. Your response time average over 12 months is 4 hours and 17 minutes. Yes. Our previous contractor's contract guaranteed 8 hours. I know. She closed the binder. Not dismissively, carefully, the way you close something you intend to open again. Why do you want this contract, Mr. Briggs? It was a direct question, and he appreciated it. Because I know your equipment better than anyone you've worked with, and I can prove it, because the work matters to me and not just as a revenue line, and because I'm not interested in being your emergency backup anymore. I'm interested in being your primary partner. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but reorganized. She was not a woman who softened easily, and he wasn't asking her to. You know, she said, and there was something almost careful in her voice now. When we first met, I made an assumption. He waited. I judged the size of your shop and assumed it reflected the size of your capability. She paused. That was a mistake. He didn't say anything. He just held the moment, the way you hold a tool that's finally done what it was built to do. I'd like to discuss terms, she said. The retainer agreement was signed 6 weeks later. It was a meaningful contract. Not just in dollars, though the dollars were real and represented the largest single revenue commitment Briggs Industrial Services had ever carried, but in what it meant for the new facility. He could plan now. He could hire with confidence. He could grow with a foundation under him instead of air. Leonard hired a second machinist friend of his from Mishawaka. Owen trained a junior tech. By the following spring, Briggs Industrial had 7 employees and had taken on 2 additional retainer clients in the county, both of whom came through referrals from Ray and Paul and people who'd watched the work. Nobody drove by the building on the east side of Elkhart and assumed it was nothing anymore. The sign out front was the same plain style, Briggs Industrial Services, but the parking lot had 10 cars in it, and through the windows you could see the lights burning and hear the hum of machines being used. Harlan still swept the floor himself most evenings. Leonard thought that was funny. He didn't explain it. He just swept. In the spring, he ran into Renata Cross at an industry event in Fort Wayne, a regional manufacturing association dinner that he'd never attended before but had started getting invitations to now that Briggs Industrial was on people's radar. She was at the cocktail reception talking to 2 men in good suits. She saw him across the room and something changed in her posture. She excused herself and walked over. Mr. Briggs, M's Cross. She looked different outside the office, still sharp, but slightly less armored. She had a glass of wine and she held it like someone who'd earned it. I hear you've taken on work with Patterson and with Davenport, she said. Word gets around. In this industry, yes. She smiled slightly. It was a real smile, brief but real. I want you to know that the relationship is working well. The floor supervisors talk about it. Ray mentioned the same. She nodded a pause. I owe you an apology. From when we first met, he was quiet for a moment. You thought I wasn't capable of the work. I thought the size of your operation meant you weren't the right fit. I confused 2 different things. He nodded slowly. Most people do. She looked at him with something close to respect. You never called me on it. You just did the work. That seemed like the better argument. She laughed, short, genuine, surprised out of her. Yes, she said. It was. They shook hands before she went back to her conversation. A real handshake this time. Equal weight held a beat. He drove home through the flat dark of the Indiana plain, the highway empty and straight, the lights of Elkhart visible well before he got to them. He thought about a lot of things on that drive. He thought about the 11 months between calls, and the 4 days with the press line and the fabricated accumulator housing. He thought about the kitchen table and the yellow notepad. He thought about Leonard and Owen and the 2 new hires and the contracts signed and the machines running clean. He wasn't a man who needed to be told he'd won anything. He wasn't even sure winning was the right word for it. He'd built a thing. A real thing from the ground up with his hands and his mind in a building on the east side of Elkhart, Indiana. That was enough. That had always been the point. He parked in front of the facility out of habit even though he was going home. He sat in the truck for a minute and looked at the building. Dark at this hour, quiet, just the security light over the loading dock. Briggs Industrial Services. He started the truck and drove home.